The temperature inside Levi Stanton's cabin held steady at 68 degrees, even though his fire had been dead for 6 hours and the January night outside had dropped to 20 below zero. His neighbors, huddled around roaring fires that devoured wood faster than they could split it, would have called it impossible if they had known. His wall glowed softly with stored heat flowing through deliberate gaps between flat river stones. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation inspire you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The fire in Levi Stanton's cabin had been burning for 11 straight hours, and still the cold pressed through the log walls like water through a sieve. He fed another split log into the flames and watched sparks spiral up toward the crude stone chimney. Across the single room, his partner Miles Corrigan sat wrapped in 2 wool blankets, his breath visible in the firelight. It was January of 1842, and the Montana Territory winter had settled into the kind of cold that made men question why they had ever left civilization. Levi walked to the door and checked the wood supply stacked against the exterior wall. They had burned through a third of their winter stores already, and February had not yet arrived. At this rate, they would run out before spring, which meant dangerous trips into the forest to cut more while the temperature stayed brutal. He had seen trappers freeze to death trying to replenish their wood during late-season cold snaps. The mathematics of survival were simple and unforgiving. Not enough wood meant not enough heat. Not enough heat meant death. Miles coughed, a deep, rattling sound that had been getting worse for 3 weeks. The constant cold was wearing him down. They kept the fire roaring, but the cabin's warmth was an illusion that existed only within 5 feet of the flames. The rest of the space hovered just above freezing. Levi had chinked the gaps between logs with moss and mud. He had hung blankets over the single window. He had even stuffed rags around the doorframe. Nothing helped. The logs themselves seemed to leak heat, conducting the interior warmth directly to the frozen exterior air. Most trappers accepted this as the price of mountain life. You burned wood constantly, you stayed cold anyway, and you hoped to survive until spring. Levi had accepted it too, for 6 winters. But watching Miles deteriorate, hearing that cough worsen despite their best efforts to keep warm, was planting a seed of frustration that grew with each log he fed to the insatiable fire. There had to be a better way. Someone, somewhere, must have solved this problem. But in 1842 Montana, there were no books to consult, no experienced builders to ask, only scattered trappers doing what they had always done because no one had ever shown them anything different. Levi added, another log. The fire blazed higher. The temperature near the hearth climbed. The far corners of the cabin remained cold. Miles pulled the blankets tighter and closed his eyes. Outside, the wind picked up, driving the temperature even lower. It was going to be a long night, just like all the others. Levi stood and walked to the window, peeling back the blanket to look out at the darkness. Snow was falling again, heavy and silent. He let the blanket drop and returned to the fire, adding yet another piece of wood to flames that seemed to give warmth only to the air directly above them, leaving everything else to the mercy of winter's grip. The cold snap arrived on the evening of January 16th, with winds that made the cabin walls groan. Levi had seen cold before, but this was different. By the time darkness fell, the temperature outside had dropped to 30 below zero, and the wind drove it lower still. Inside, despite a fire that consumed wood at an alarming rate, the cold crept in from every direction. Levi and Miles took turns feeding the flames, neither man able to sleep for more than an hour at a time. The fire could not be allowed to die. Even a brief lapse would let the cold establish a foothold that might prove impossible to reverse. Miles's cough had worsened throughout the day. By midnight, he was shivering violently, even wrapped in every blanket they owned, positioned as close to the fire as safety allowed. Levi kept the flames high, burning wood they could not afford to spare, but the mathematics were brutal. The cabin was losing heat faster than the fire could generate it. The logs, the gaps, the very structure of their shelter was working against them. Levi watched Miles struggle to breathe, watched him pull the blankets tighter, and felt helpless in a way he had never experienced. They were doing everything right, and it was not enough. At 3 in the morning, Levi added the last easily accessible wood to the fire. He would need to go outside to bring more from the main stack. He pulled on his heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and opened the door. The wind hit him like a physical blow. The short walk to the woodpile took twice as long as it should have. His hands went numb, even inside thick gloves. He grabbed an armload of split logs and fought his way back to the door, ice already forming on his eyebrows. Inside, he kicked the door shut and dropped the wood beside the hearth, his lungs burning from the cold air he had breathed. Miles had not moved. Levi added wood to the fire and turned to check on his partner. Something was wrong. Miles was too still. Levi crossed the cabin in 3 steps and put a hand on Miles's shoulder. The cold that met his touch was not the cold of the cabin air. It was deeper, absolute. Levi pulled the blankets back. Miles's eyes were open, staring at nothing. His chest was not moving. Levi tried to find a pulse, already knowing what he would discover. Miles Corrigan was dead. He had frozen to death 6 feet from a roaring fire, inside a cabin, wrapped in wool blankets, with his partner doing everything possible to keep him alive. Levi sat back, the reality settling over him like the cold itself. This should not have been possible. They had done everything right. The fire had never gone out. Yet Miles had died anyway, killed by cold that their cabin could not keep at bay. Something fundamental was wrong with how they built shelter, how they fought winter, how they survived. And in that moment, sitting beside his dead partner in a cabin that could not protect them, Levi made a decision. He would figure out why this had happened, and he would make sure it never happened again. Levi buried Miles on a hillside, overlooking the creek where they had trapped together for 3 seasons. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep. It took him 2 days to dig the grave, working in shifts, building fires to thaw the earth layer by layer. He marked the site with stones and stood there for a long time afterward, not praying, just thinking. Miles had died inside a shelter, beside a fire, doing everything men were supposed to do to survive winter. That meant the shelter itself was the problem. Back in the cabin, Levi began a systematic examination of everything they had built. He traced the gaps between logs, noting how chinked moss had dried and cracked, creating channels for cold air. He studied the door, seeing how the frame had warped slightly, leaving spaces around the edges. He examined the single window, covered with oiled paper that flexed and moved with every gust of wind. He looked at the chimney, a crude stack of stones mortared with mud that leaked smoke and heat equally. Every element of the cabin was designed to be built quickly, not to hold warmth. Over the next week, Levi visited the 3 other trapper cabins within a day's travel. He told them what had happened to Miles, and each man nodded with the grim recognition of someone who had seen similar deaths. Orson Blake had lost a partner 4 years earlier the same way. Nolan Teague said his brother had frozen in a cabin in Wyoming. Curtis Ballard just shook his head and said winter killed men, that was its nature. None of them questioned the cabins themselves. They accepted cold interiors, constant fires, and high wood consumption as unchangeable facts of frontier life. Levi could not accept it. He started experimenting with modifications to his own cabin. He stuffed more moss into gaps. He built a second layer of oiled paper over the window. He constructed a crude mud wall behind the fire to reflect heat back into the room. Nothing made a significant difference. The cabin still bled warmth from every surface. He realized the problem was not the gaps, though they contributed. The problem was the logs themselves. Wood conducted heat. Every log in his wall was a thermal bridge, pulling warmth from inside and transferring it to the frozen air outside, sealing gaps, helped at the margins, but it did not address the fundamental issue. He needed mass. He needed something that could absorb heat, hold it, and release it slowly. Stone was the obvious answer. But how? Building an entire cabin from stone was impossible without skilled masons and equipment he did not have. A stone fireplace helped, but was not enough. He sat in his cabin one evening, feeding the fire and thinking, when the idea came to him. Not a stone cabin, a stone wall. A massive wall that could absorb the fire's heat and radiate it back long after the flames died. But how to build such a wall, and how to make it actually work? Spring arrived late in 1843, but when the ice finally broke on the creek, Levi was there every day. He was not trapping, he was studying stones. The riverbank was littered with rocks of every size and shape, worn smooth by decades of water flow. Most trappers saw building material. Levi saw something different. He saw how flat stones stacked compared to irregular ones. He noticed how water-worn surfaces created different contact points than rough fieldstone. He began testing. He built small experimental walls away from the cabin, stacking stones in different configurations. Rough fieldstones, the kind most settlers used, created unstable towers with large, irregular gaps. They rocked when pushed and required excessive mortar to hold position. Flat river stones, which most men ignored as too smooth to grip properly, stacked with surprising stability. Their flat surfaces created predictable contact points. More importantly, when stacked horizontally in tight layers, they created thin, consistent gaps between courses rather than the random voids that appeared with irregular stones. Levi became obsessed with gap spacing. He built test sections with different measurements. Gaps of 1 inch were too large and created drafts. Gaps of 1/8 inch were too tight and prevented airflow entirely. Somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 inch seemed optimal. At that spacing, air could move through the layers, but wind could not penetrate. He tested this by building fires against his small experimental walls and watching how heat behaved. With proper gap spacing, warmth penetrated deep into the stone mass rather than simply heating the surface. The theory solidified through observation and testing. If he built a massive stone wall against his cabin with controlled thin gaps between horizontal layers, heat from his interior fire could flow into that stone mass. The stones would absorb and store the heat. Then, as the fire died and the cabin cooled, the stored heat would radiate back inward. The wall would act as a thermal battery, charged by the fire and slowly discharged over many hours. The key was using flat river stones that allowed precise gap control and tight overall construction. His neighbors noticed his activities. Orson Blake rode past one afternoon and found Levi kneeling beside the creek, sorting through hundreds of stones and keeping only certain ones. "What are you building, Levi? A wall or a puzzle?" Orson asked. Levi explained the concept. Flat stones, horizontal layers, controlled gaps, thermal storage. Orson listened politely, then shook his head. "River stones are too smooth. They will not hold. And gaps mean cold air gets in. Everyone knows tight construction means no gaps at all." He rode away, convinced Levi's grief had damaged his thinking. Nolan Teague had similar reactions when he visited. "You are wasting time. Any rock works for building. Why spend days selecting specific stones?" Levi tried to explain how flat surfaces created predictable gaps, but Nolan cut him off. "Heat escapes through gaps. That is just physics. You are building a wall that will freeze you." Levi did not argue. He simply continued gathering stones, selecting only those that met his increasingly specific criteria, preparing for construction that would begin as soon as the ground thawed completely. Construction began in early May of 1843. Levi had spent 3 weeks gathering stones, and his collection covered 20 square feet of ground beside his cabin. Every stone was flat. Every stone was river-worn smooth. Every stone had been selected for specific size and shape. He had rejected hundreds of candidates, keeping only those that met his criteria. His neighbors had watched this process with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. Most settled on pity. The wall location was deliberate. Levi chose the north-facing side of his cabin, the side that took the worst wind and cold during winter. He dug a shallow foundation trench and filled it with gravel for drainage. Then he began laying stones. The first course went down with mortar he had mixed from clay, sand, and water. Each stone was positioned carefully, its flat surface creating contact with the stones beside and beneath it. Between each horizontal course, he left a gap, not an accidental gap, a deliberate space, approximately 3/8 of an inch, maintained with small wooden shims he would remove once the mortar set. Nolan Teague visited on the third day of construction. He stood watching Levi work for 10 minutes before speaking. "You are leaving gaps on purpose." It was a statement, not a question. Levi nodded, focused on setting a stone at precisely the right height. Nolan stepped closer. "Why would you do that? Gaps let heat escape. Everyone knows this." Levi paused and turned to face him. "Gaps let heat in, not out. The heat from my fire will flow through these spaces into the stone mass. The stones will store it and radiate it back after the fire dies." Nolan stared at him. "That is not how heat works. Heat rises and escapes. It does not flow into rocks and sit there." Levi tried to explain thermal mass, how stone absorbed and held warmth, how controlled airflow allowed heat penetration without creating drafts. Nolan listened with the expression of a man, humoring someone unwell. "Levi, I understand you lost Miles, but this will not bring him back. You are wasting your time building something that will make your cabin colder, not warmer. Please, just build it the normal way." Levi returned to his work without responding. Nolan left shaking his head. Orson Blake stopped by a week later. By then, the wall had reached 4 feet high, and the gaps between courses were clearly visible. "I can see daylight through your wall, Levi," Orson said. "You have built it wrong." Levi did not look up. "It is built exactly as I intend." Orson walked around the structure, examining it from multiple angles. "This is madness. Smooth river stones and deliberate gaps. You are doing the opposite of everything that works." He left shortly after, and Levi heard him tell Curtis Ballard that Gap Wall had finally lost his mind completely. Only Curtis Ballard did not mock. He visited twice during construction, watched in silence, asked no questions. Levi noticed him studying the stone selection, the gap spacing, the overall technique. Curtis seemed curious rather than skeptical, but he said nothing either way. 7 weeks after he began, Levi's wall stood complete. The completed wall stood 8 feet tall and ran the entire length of the cabin's north side. Levi had used over 300 carefully selected flat river stones, each one positioned to create the tight horizontal layering his theory required. The mortar between stones was strong, but the gaps remained exactly as he had designed them. Thin horizontal slits running the full length of the wall at each course level. To anyone looking at it, the structure appeared incomplete, as if the builder had simply failed to fill the spaces properly. The interior work was equally precise. Levi repositioned his fireplace so its back faced the stone wall with only 6 inches of clearance. He calculated that heat radiating from the fireplace's back would warm the air in that narrow space. That heated air would then flow through the gaps into the stone mass. As the stones absorbed heat, they would draw in more warm air, creating a continuous circulation. The system would charge the thermal battery whenever fire burned. When the fire died, the process would reverse. Stored heat in the stones would radiate back through the gaps into the cabin. The theory was sound in his mind, but theory and reality often diverged, especially in construction projects attempted by self-taught trappers with no engineering training. Levi knew he might have wasted 7 weeks of labor on a monument to grief-driven foolishness. He would not know until winter tested the design under brutal conditions. For now, all he could do was finish the details and wait. The mockery intensified as word spread. Trappers traveling through the area made detours to see Gap Wall's folly. Men he had never met stopped by to examine the structure and shake their heads. The comments followed predictable patterns. Why? River stones when fieldstone is everywhere? And those gaps will whistle like a flute in the wind, and smooth stones will not hold when frost heaves the ground, and I give it 1 winter before the whole thing collapses. Levi listened, without defending his work. Words would not convince anyone. Only results mattered. Orson Blake brought 3 other trappers by in late July. They stood in a semicircle examining the wall while Orson narrated, "See how he left gaps between every layer? And look at the stones, smooth as river ice, no grip at all. Come December, he will be colder than the rest of us combined." One of the trappers asked Levi directly why he had built something so obviously flawed. Levi explained the thermal mass theory one more time. The trapper laughed. "Rocks do not store heat, friend. They are just rocks. Cold in winter, hot in summer. That is their nature." Curtis Ballard visited alone one evening as Levi was applying a final layer of mortar to seal the top course. Curtis walked around the entire structure slowly, occasionally touching the stones, running his fingers along the gaps. He said nothing for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. "When winter comes, I would like to visit, to see if it works." Levi nodded. "You are welcome any time." Curtis left without further comment, but something in his tone suggested he was the only man in the territory who thought the wall might actually succeed. Levi moved back into the cabin in early September when the nights began carrying the first hints of cold. He had spent the summer months living rough, camping outside, while he completed the wall construction and interior modifications. Now, with everything finished, he could finally test whether 7 weeks of labor had produced innovation or folly. The testing would be gradual. Autumn temperatures would reveal small problems. Winter would expose catastrophic ones. The first fire in the modified fireplace burned on September 12th. Levi kept it small and watched carefully. Heat radiated from the flames as expected, but he was interested in what happened at the back of the fireplace where stone met the narrow air gap. He held his hand near the opening. Warm air was moving, not rushing, not creating a draft, just flowing steadily into the gap and up through the horizontal slits in the stone wall. He went outside and placed his hand near the exterior surface of the wall. Nothing, no heat escaping. The stones were working exactly as he had theorized, absorbing warmth before it could reach the outer surface. He let the fire burn for 3 hours, then extinguished it completely. This was the real test. A standard cabin would begin losing heat immediately. If his wall worked, the stored thermal mass would radiate warmth back into the space for hours afterward. He sat at his small table and waited. 1 hour passed. The cabin remained warm. 2 hours. Still comfortable. 3 hours after the fire had gone cold, the interior temperature had dropped only slightly. He could feel heat radiating from the wall, a gentle, steady warmth that filled the space without the intense concentrated heat of an active fire. The results exceeded his hopes. Over the next weeks, he refined his technique. He learned that burning a hot fire for 2 hours charged the stones more effectively than a low fire for 4 hours. He discovered that the stones held heat longest when he banked coals at the fire's end rather than extinguishing flames abruptly. He found that opening the door for ventilation cooled the cabin quickly, but barely affected the wall's stored heat. The thermal mass was essentially independent of air temperature, releasing its warmth on a slower timeline than air could absorb or lose it. Neighbors passed by occasionally, and word spread that Levi's cabin seemed unusually warm for the amount of smoke coming from his chimney. Orson Blake mentioned it to Nolan Teague, who dismissed it. "September is not winter. Wait until January. Then we will see Gap Wall freezing like the rest of us." But there was uncertainty in his voice now, a small crack in the certainty that had characterized earlier mockery. Curtis Ballard visited in mid-October. Levi invited him inside. The cabin was comfortably warm, though no fire burned. Curtis stood near the stone wall and held his hand close to the surface. "It is radiating heat," he said quietly. "How long since your fire went out?" Levi checked his pocket watch. 5 hours. Curtis turned and looked at him with an expression that was no longer skeptical. It was something closer to wonder. The cold snap arrived on January 9th, 1844. Levi woke to a silence that only extreme cold created, the kind of stillness where air itself seemed frozen solid. He checked the thermometer he had mounted outside his window. 20 below zero, and the sun had not yet risen. By afternoon, it would drop further. This was the test he had been waiting for. Everything he had built, all The theory and labor and mockery endured would be validated or destroyed in the next 24 hours. He built his fire at dawn, a hot, fast burn that consumed split pine and sent heat pouring into the stone wall. He could hear the faint movement of air through the gaps, a soft whisper as warm circulation pulled through the horizontal slits. Outside, smoke rose from chimneys across the scattered trapper community. Thick columns of continuous smoke indicating fires that would burn all day and all night. Men were already feeding their constant battle against cold that would kill them if they lost focus for even an hour. Levi let his fire burn for 3 hours, then allowed it to die. He did not bank coals. He did not add final logs. He simply let the flames consume the last of their fuel and fade to ash. It was noon. The temperature outside had reached 23 below zero. Inside his cabin, the thermometer read 65 degrees. The stone wall radiated gentle, steady heat, its mass fully charged. Now came the true test. Could it hold through the night? He spent the afternoon reading, doing minor repairs to his traps, melting snow for water. The cabin remained comfortable. By sunset, the interior temperature had dropped to 62 degrees. Outside, the cold intensified, 25 below, then 27. By full dark, it reached 30 below zero, and the wind picked up. Levi could hear it testing his cabin, probing for weakness. He lay down on his sleeping platform at 8 in the evening. The fire had been dead for 7 hours. The cabin was still warm. He woke at midnight and checked the thermometer. 58 degrees inside, 31 below outside. The stone wall was still radiating heat, still holding back the killing cold. He went back to sleep. At dawn, he woke again. 53 degrees inside, 29 below outside. The fire had been dead for 19 hours, and his cabin was warmer than most cabins got with fires actively burning. He built a new fire, a morning routine fire, and went outside to gather snow. Smoke rose from every chimney he could see. Thick, continuous, desperate smoke. He knew what was happening in those cabins. Men exhausted from feeding fires all night. Wood supplies being consumed at unsustainable rates. Interiors that were barely tolerable despite maximum effort. He looked at his own chimney, a modest plume that would burn for 2 hours and then stop. His wood supply had barely been touched. He was warm, rested, and using 1/3 the fuel of everyone around him. The wall worked. The impossible worked. And now people would start asking questions. Curtis Ballard arrived 3 days after the cold snap broke. Levi was outside splitting wood when he saw Curtis riding up the trail, his horse moving slowly through snow that had drifted waist-high in places. Curtis dismounted and tied his horse, then stood for a moment, looking at Levi's cabin. Specifically at the stone wall. Steam rose from his coat in the cold air. He looked exhausted. "May I come inside?" Curtis asked. Levi nodded and let him in. The cabin was warm, not blazing hot, just comfortably warm. Curtis removed his heavy coat and stood near the center of the room. His eyes went immediately to the fireplace. It was cold. Ashes sat undisturbed. "When did your fire go out?" he asked. Levi checked his watch. 4 hours ago. Curtis walked slowly to the stone wall and stood before it, not touching, just looking at the horizontal gaps where thin lines of shadow marked each course. "During the cold snap, I burned wood for 36 hours straight," Curtis said quietly. "I did not sleep. I could not. If the fire had died, I would have frozen. I went through half my winter supply in 3 days." He paused. "I saw your chimney. Smoke for a few hours each day. Then nothing. I told myself you must be freezing, that you were too stubborn to admit your wall had failed. But you are not freezing, are you?" Levi shook his head. Curtis stepped closer to the wall. "May I touch it?" Levi gestured permission. Curtis placed his palm flat against the stone surface. He held it there for several seconds, then pressed his other hand beside the first. His expression changed. "It is warm. The stone itself is warm." He turned to look at Levi. "How is this possible?" "Your fire has been out for 4 hours." Levi explained what he had learned. The flat river stones created controlled gaps that allowed heat to penetrate the mass. The thermal storage capacity of that much stone was enormous. Heat charged in during a short, hot fire, then radiated back over 12 to 18 hours. The system was self-sustaining with only 2 fires per day, one in morning and one in evening. Curtis listened without interrupting, his hand still pressed against the warm stone. "Can you teach me?" Curtis asked. "Can you help me build one?" Levi agreed immediately. Curtis nodded slowly, then did something unexpected. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside. Levi followed. Curtis went directly to the exterior face of the stone wall and placed his bare hand against it. The air temperature was 15 below zero. Curtis held his hand on the stone for 5 seconds, then 10. When he pulled it away, his expression had shifted from wonder to something approaching awe. "The outside of your wall is warm," Curtis said. "In 15 below air, the exterior stones are warm to the touch. That means the interior mass is saturated with heat." He looked at Levi. "This changes everything. You know that, right? This changes how we survive winter." Levi and Curtis began construction on Curtis's wall in April of 1844. They spent 2 weeks at the riverbank selecting stones, with Levi teaching Curtis how to identify the right flatness, size variation, and surface characteristics. Curtis was a quick student, and his wall went up in 5 weeks with both men working. When winter returned, Curtis burned half the wood he had, used the previous year, and stayed warmer than he ever had. Word spread quietly. Orson Blake visited Curtis in December to see the wall for himself. He stood in the warm cabin with no fire burning and touched the stones. He said nothing, but 2 months later he appeared at Levi's door asking questions about gap spacing and stone selection. Levi spent 3 days helping Orson begin his own wall. Nolan Teague held out longer, insisting through the winter of 1845 that traditional methods were sufficient. But in spring of 1846, after another brutal season burning through wood supplies, he came to Levi as well. Over the next 3 years, 5 more river stone walls appeared in the scattered trapping community. Each builder added minor variations based on available materials or specific cabin designs. But the core principle remained constant: flat stones, horizontal layers, controlled gaps, thermal mass storage. The technique spread to other trappers through observation and conversation. No one called it an invention, no one credited Levi specifically. It simply became something men knew how to do, like chinking logs or building chimneys, another piece of frontier wisdom passed from one survivor to another. Levi never sought recognition. When trappers asked him questions, he answered fully and helped with construction when asked. When they thanked him, he simply said he had figured out what the stones could do and that anyone would have done the same. He lived alone in his cabin with the wall that had started everything, trapping each season, surviving each winter with comfort that would have seemed impossible a few years earlier. By 1867, the Montana Territory was changing. The fur trade had long since collapsed. Settlers were arriving in numbers, bringing families and building towns. Levi was 61 years old, still living in his original cabin. His wall stood solid, showing no signs of deterioration after 24 winters. Young settlers occasionally stopped to examine it, asking the old man how he had built such a structure. Levi told them about flat river stones and gap spacing, about thermal mass and controlled heat flow. Some built their own versions. Others used different methods. It did not matter to Levi. He had solved the problem that had killed Miles. That was enough. Levi Stanton died in his sleep on a January night in 1868. Neighbors found him 3 days later, lying peacefully on his sleeping platform. The cabin was still warm. A fire had burned out sometime during his final day, and the stones had kept radiating heat long after his heart had stopped. They buried him beside Miles on the hillside overlooking the creek. His cabin passed to new occupants who never knew the builder's name, but were grateful every winter for walls that glowed softly with stored warmth, keeping them alive through cold that killed men in lesser shelters.